Dudut, Falcha, welcome back. Video number 2 of The Believer about John Mack. And we are on chapter 11, The Peacemaker. So Mack was involved in research for his Lawrence book, but he was also very caught up in the Middle Eastern conflict, which makes sense because he's been, studying Arabia. In 1973, he wrote a paper on the psychology of the dispute in the Middle East. He said it was 70% of the conflict was psychological. Sadat and Begin got together. Mack went to Egypt. He met with Arafat to discuss peace, and the conversation was fraught, but he was in the thick of it, trying to establish peaceful relationships. Very interesting. So chapter 12, Danny's Gift. He saw that his family saw that he was struggling with some sort of spiritual transformation and was suffering an alienating restlessness. He was always traveling, and he had multiple affairs, of which his wife was aware. Not happy, but aware. They somehow seemed to work it out, but he was very popular with the young students and the ladies. They saw psychological difficulties in his older son, Danny. And Mack thought this was because of the school that Danny was attending. There were issues at this school. There was a gifted student who had hanged herself, and the son was having problems about this. So Mack wrote a book with her autobiographical writings to help understand teen suicide. He became an expert on teen suicide. So in 1981, he wrote the book Vivienne, The Life and Suicide of an Adolescent Girl. It was critically acclaimed. In 1988, he wrote The Alchemy of Survival, a Romanian woman's story of surviving the Nazis. His son, Danny, was very interested in the supernatural. He'd heard the Hills story on the radio in 1975. He also pursued mind-body work. They both followed Earhart seminar trainings, EST, which I didn't even go into. I mean, it's all, I don't know. So he went to UC Berkeley, but after 2 years, he spent a summer, 1981, in Japan in a Zen monastery. This is his son, Danny. And eventually, after spending time in this monastery, he left and he attended Hampshire College, which was a brand new university. So he was kind of on a quest too, a parallel quest. Chapter 13, More Activist Than the Movement. Mack joined the Anti-Nuke Physicians for Social Responsibility and in 1980 attended the Anti-Nuke Symposium in San Francisco. So let's see here. From Erik Erikson, Mack had become familiar with the concept of pseudo-speciation, the delusion that different groups of people were different species, making it easier to kill them. Nations, like individuals, were historically locked in a self-other, good-evil, me-you duality, with differences settled by political negotiation or war. With 20,000 nuclear warheads pointing at each other, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were poised for mutual suicide. Yet military strategists still talked of fighting and winning a nuclear war, a fully human reaction to the terror and helplessness of the dilemma. There was one promising development, Mack concluded. Soviet and American doctors had recently pledged to work together to avert a nuclear catastrophe. It's not too late to begin, he said. And there's where this organization began. They formed International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War with famous Soviet doctors. This group included Carl Sagan. Mack convincingly advocated that the group be activists. There was a lot of debate. Were they there for academics and philosophy, or were they there to actually get on the streets and demonstrate? He argued that doctors were responsible to speak out to save lives. This had to do with people's health, and it was an important role for doctors, because there were a lot of snooty doctor boss type people who were, well, this is not our job. And he argued that, yes, it absolutely is our job. And in 1985, the group won the Nobel Prize for Peace. In 1983, he established the Center for Psychiatric Studies in the Nuclear Age at Harvard, which later became a program for extraordinary experience research, PEER, P-E-E-R. And later that became the John E. Mack Institute, enshrining all of his abduction research, which is interesting, as you'll see. He wrote the text on self-esteem in childhood and argued very persuasively against the notion in Christianity that pride was a bad thing. He set children up for a lack of self-esteem, which becomes a huge problem. He said a child needs assurance that it won't be abandoned. This is how self-esteem is established. And without it, a child feels abandoned and can be externally hostile or internally aggressive to himself. He met Edward Teller, the guy with the hydrogen bomb, who hated Mack's anti-nuke stance. Mack thought Teller was a lunatic. He was friends with Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers secretly. They did anti-nuke protests together. They were arrested at a protest at a Nevada nuclear test site with Mack's son Kenny. Kenny became a very vocal activist, and he even went on Nickelodeon to do an anti-nuke program on Nickelodeon. Mack worked to target corporate bigwigs to be anti-nuclear. He felt that would be really effective. He ended up having an affair with a woman named Roz Zander, the wife of the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic, and this went on for quite some time. Traveled in rarefied circles. Chapter 14, They Put a Hole in My Psyche. He went to Big Sur, where there's I love Big Sur, where there's a hot springs and a spa and a retreat, as I wrote, a retreat full of weirdos. It listed all these people, and they were just 1960s style, leftover people. This became Esalen, Maslow, and Huxley, and Toynbee, and Timothy Leary, and Ram Dass. All those guys were hanging out there at the time. And Ken Kesey, Joseph Campbell, the Beatles, Terence McKenna. It was all about drugs and the counterculture and psychology and LSD. And he ended up meeting Lawrence Rockefeller in what he called hot tub diplomacy. Esalen became the place for opposite sides in the Cold War to be friendly. People would go there who had absolutely opposite opinions, and hot tub diplomacy. Mack was invited to speak, and this is where he was introduced to the notion of holotropic breath work. Get himself out of his head. Yeah. Chapter 15, The Turquoise Maiden. Mack was taught these breathing techniques at Esalen that took him back to the death of his mother. And he saw her as blue at her death. I mean, he was only 8 months old. He obviously didn't witness that. But he always imagined her as a blue being at her death. And in some strange way associated with this, the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio, which was a favorite story of his. And then he had a vision of fetuses in an incubator. And, oh God, that scared me. Somebody slammed a door. A little jumpy. He had this vision of fetuses and incubators, that invaders from outer space were taking resources from the planet and taking our bodies and doing hybridization, and it was a punishment for not loving one another enough. It's weird, very weird, to have this long before he heard abduction stories. So he attended this big family get-together at Christmas time in 1988. But despite this illusion of the happy family, extended family get-together and the long marriage, he was having this huge affair with this Roz woman. His wife knew all about it. In 1989, he was invited to read some work by Keith Thompson, who claimed he had been abducted in 1966 as a child, and who was very active in the UFO community. He knew Whitley Strieber, Bud Hopkins, and Hynek. And let's see what I thought was important here. In this chapter, in Thompson's chapter, about a guy called Groff, Dr. Groff, who did breath work. He called the UFO Encounter experience as the crisis of transformation. Thompson examined the phenomenon as a rite of initiation. He was not so concerned with what was objectively true. That might never be knowable. Rather, his approach was phenomenological. He wanted to see what people reported about their experience, unencumbered by questions of what could and could not be real. Viewed in that way, the encounters with aliens resembled timeless and familiar human rites of transition or initiation. The hero's journey. The hero's journey is what the tarot is all about. Popularized by the mythological Joseph Campbell. First, a separation or departure from the existing state, the way a boy in an indigenous culture might leave his childhood behind at home before entering the initiation lodge to manhood. Then the entrance into a shadow realm of marginality betwixt and between, where one is both the old thing and the new. And finally, an aggregation stage when the experiences are resembled into a new state of being. In Campbell's epic 12-stage mythology, the hero lives an everyday life until confronted with a challenge that summons him to his journey. He refuses it, but encounters a mentor who steels him for the struggles ahead. He crosses the first threshold to a new world with tests of will, daunting enemies, and staunch allies. He suffers setbacks, forcing new strategies, and endures a terrible ordeal, but triumphs to earn a reward. He sets off home only to suffer a final trial that risks the entire journey. He succeeds again, returning to present his boon to a grateful world. And in this context, the UFO encounter is a hero's journey. Mack read this and wondered, okay, but what if it's true, too? What if it's real? So he went home, and in January of 1990, finally, after many failed attempts by people to get them together, he finally met Bud Hopkins. And this is described as his own call to a hero's journey, his own call to adventure. Because this really started out interviewing the experiencers. Chapter 16, Sane Citizen Sees UFO in New Jersey. So in 1938, there was the famous War of the Worlds radio program. Bud Hopkins was 7 years old. He said his parents panicked. They packed to flee. They were going to run away from the alien Martian invasions. He remembered that vividly. He went to Oberlin also, but he was 2 years after Mack was there. He studied art. In the 1950s, he moved to Greenwich Village. He was close friends with Rothko and de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. He was actually a well-respected, famous artist. He had a studio on Cape Cod where he saw a UFO, and he started reading up on them. And then a friend told him this story, a chilling tale from his friend, local Chelsea wine seller. After locking up one midnight, George Obarski said that he was driving home in New Jersey when his car radio began emitting a strange tinny sound. He was fiddling with it when a huge bright object passed his car and landed in North Hudson Park, a 167-acre cliff-top triangle of greenery about halfway between the Lincoln Tunnel and the George Washington Bridge across the river from Manhattan's West 80s. Obarski described it as a roundish, 30-foot-long craft with a row of vertical windows. He then watched incredulous as a hatch opened and nearly a dozen short figures in light-colored hooded garments descended like kids in snowsuits. Ignoring him, they dug into the ground, spooning earth into little bags, and then returned to the ship and flew off, all within less than 4 minutes. Obarski drove home shaking. The next morning, as he told Hopkins, he returned to the spot and found about 15 small holes. Then he really got spooked. Fearing ridicule, he kept the story to himself, but now he asked Hopkins what to do. So Bud had a friend who was a UFO investigator that he contacted. Bud wrote an article for the Village Voice called Sane Citizen Sees UFO in New Jersey, all about this friend. And in response, readers got in touch with him. Many, many stories. He knew a hypnotist, a psychiatrist, a hypnotherapist, and he asked him to meet with these people, talk to them, see what he could find out. So the friend taught Hopkins how to do hypnotherapy, and he began recording the stories that people told him. So in 1981, he wrote Missing Time about these stories. He got a grant to study possible explanations for what was going on, like mental health explanations. He worked with Elizabeth Staler, a clinical psychiatrist, and found that the UFO experiences were trauma, and that we read about this before. I can't remember where, but I recognize her name. Her theory was that UFO experiencers did have PTSD, like a rape victim. He got in touch with David Jacobs of Temple University, who had written his dissertation on UFOs. He was the first professor to teach a university course on it. It's very interesting. He's a little curmudgeonly. It's very interesting. He thinks it's a bad situation. This is not good. You know, some people believe, now this is wonderful and we're being moved to a higher level of energy and dimension, and they're giving us knowledge and trying to help us and save us. And David Jacobs is like, no, you know. Guess what happened to the Native Americans when the white people showed up? Kind of an analogous situation. Hopkins wrote his book Intruders. All right, that was the name of his book, Intruders, about a woman with 9 hybrid babies who had been part of a cosmic breeding program. Not fiction. She truly had this story. And it included a lot of stories that were global, that were similar. And so the question is, we still are not resolving any answers here. The question is, was Hopkins uncovering an unknown mental problem, or was this real? Chapter 17, Mack's Secret. So Mack was following the work of, there are some people, the Dalai Lama, Arafat, and now we have him interacting with Václav Havel, the revolutionary in Czechoslovakia, and Daniel Ellsberg, and the three of them got together. Meanwhile, his personal relationships are falling apart. He was suffering vague physical complaints like muscle pain and stuff. And then he met with Shirley Temple Black, who at the time was the ambassador to Czechoslovakia under Bush. So when he left Czechoslovakia, he remembered that he had a letter at home from Bud Hopkins. And he started seriously wondering about these UFO things. He had not really pursued it because he was busy in Czechoslovakia bringing peace to the Eastern Europe. So later, Ellsberg thought that the trip to Prague had pushed Mack over the deep end because he, Ellsberg, and others didn't know how long Mack had been dealing with this UFO idea. He didn't realize that this was not something new, that this has been something he'd been thinking about and working with for a while. So Ellsberg and friends thought it was segmented psychosis because he was such a high-functioning person, and yet here he is talking about aliens, and they thought he was nuts. Chapter 18, he's got this glass jar. This is a quote. We'll get to it. So Mack had a former medical school roommate, Lester Grinspoon, and they were pals with Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan got John Mack to try marijuana. And he wrote an article called Marijuana Reconsidered in 1971. And let's see here, Grinspoon became the senior psychiatrist and founding editor of the American Psychiatric Association Annual Review and the Harvard Mental Health Letter. Mack was experimenting with LSD, and he claimed that it opened his consciousness. He told Grinspoon about Bud Hopkins. Grinspoon thought Mack was nuts. Mack was out of his mind, and he told Mack, "Don't tell anybody else that you're doing this or talking about this." But they all met with Mack and Grinspoon and Bud Hopkins and Sagan, got together, and he told them about all this research and showed them the letters and stuff. And Sagan and Grinspoon were just horrified. So he accused Sagan of, Mack said Sagan was guarding the gates of change, resisting, Sagan had co-written Intelligent Life in the Universe with a Russian scientist, and it discussed ET contact in the historical sense, and he was denied tenure at Howard University because of it. He moved on to Cornell and became the director of the Laboratory of Planetary Studies at Cornell, but he had this little sensitive spot because E.T. and the story of aliens had denied him tenure at Howard. He chaired NASA's committee, and they made recordings to send into space for ETs about human life that was put on the Voyager in 1977. And they basically said it was a bottle launched, hopefully, into the cosmic ocean. Sagan wrote The Dragons of Eden, and he did the show Cosmos. And he insisted that alien life, if it's going to be studied, should be studied scientifically. For example, with radio beams from SETI. This was kind of antithetical to Mack's approach, which was more touchy-feely. And Sagan was unimpressed with Mack's narratives. He thought that if you're going to have extraordinary claims, like these stories, then you needed extraordinary evidence. Mack met again with Bud Hopkins and some of Bud's subjects. For example, Linda Corteil, whose real name was Napolitano, but she went by the name Corteil to hide her identity in the book Not Intruders. No, there's another book that Bud Hopkins wrote about, maybe it is Intruders, about her floating out of the tall building in New York and being witnessed by cops and security guards. She was floated out the window and taken across the Brooklyn Bridge. And, the story is just fantastic, with an anonymous high official, which we'll get to here in a minute. But Mack recognized that this woman had suffered some kind of trauma. She wasn't mentally ill. She had like a PTSD type of thing. So he did a psychiatric interview, extensive one with her. He said, she's not psychotic. She's not faking it. There's something real going on. She's not making it up. She's not delusional, but I don't know what she is. He heard stories of sightings, lost time, being abducted, insemination, forced fetal removal, and so he started to talk to people. He also heard about apocalyptic images being shown to people of a dying world and powerful ecological disasters and a need for consciousness about it. He told a group at Esalen, and they had a training meeting in Canada, and he told this group of Esalen in Canada about all this. He had Richard Tarnas, who was a big astrologer, do his chart, and he was afraid that he was going to go off too enthralled. And Tarnas said, "Yeah, your chart shows that you're like that you get obsessed with something, but you need to be more careful and less enthralled with things." Mack saw this as a spiritual manifestation, the abduction thing, a spiritual manifestation penetrating reality in a very physical way. He recognized the stories of some sort of a reproductive program as a blow to our collective consciousness, and he thought historically it was like blow number 4. Blow number 1 was Copernicus, who said the earth was not the center of the universe. Number 2 was Darwin, who said man is not the center of creation. Number 3 is Freud, who said that man is not rational, man is primal. And then number 4 is that ETs, we are not ourselves, that we can't control ourselves, that other entities from elsewhere are capable of controlling us. It's like a existential thing. So he ascribed his learning of this and his openness to all of it to the breath work that he had learned at Big Sur and Esalen, that they provided a pathway to other dimensions, to encounter other realities. Could be argued. And as a doctor, he saw all of this, these people, as an untreated and misunderstood population. He didn't dismiss them as crazy people, which was kind of the reaction. He told a group to keep all of this quiet. When he told the Esalen people in Canada, he said, "Keep it quiet, I'm going to publish about this." So in chapter 19, the abduction syndrome, in 1992, they had a UFO conference at the Santa Barbara Center for Humanistic Studies. Mack, Hopkins, and Jacob were there. Wish I'd known. They said that abductees feel a part of something momentous. They feel, when it's over with, the trauma of it, they feel like they're more ethical, they're more empathetic. They may actually sort of bond with these ET creatures. Are they being given a survival strategy? This needs to be studied. They often claim to have more psychic abilities. Mack believed the government knew all about this situation. The government knew it was helpless. It knew that it couldn't protect us. It knew that if we found out, we'd all freak out, or it assumed people would freak out, and that's why the big secrecy. UFOs made a mockery of government domination, protection, and control. He said, this is not make-believe. These people are not hoaxing, not intentionally hoaxing. Is this reality, or is this some new category of phenomenon? So he wrote a 103-page draft called The Abduction Syndrome. And he couldn't get admitted into any kind of meetings. People were like, no. He treated 34 people, including a few kids, and documented it. He felt that women were more likely to come forward and admit to this, but it happened pretty equally to everybody, gender-wise. He decried what he referred to as the scientific boycott of the subject. He felt that they were just, once again, digging their heels in. An emergency room doctor, a specialist, extrapolated that he'd seen so many cases, and he kept a running tally of cases. And he'd seen as many as 200,000 cases by 1988. Some extrapolated there might be as many as 1 million people, but based on David Jacobs' surveys, there were more than 4 million. So there's obviously, they can't agree on the prevalence of this at all. But it seems like it's a lot. At the time that this was all going on was that huge public debate about satanic panic, that satanic groups were possibly doing things, weird ritualistic stuff, or people were having false memories implanted about sexual abuse. Most agree at this point that it was pseudo-scientific error that ended up fouling up people's memory. Memory is very weird. We're going to talk about it somewhat in the next book. Memory is very weird, and it's easily manipulated. And in 1990, there was alleged recovered memory of an adult daughter who claimed she remembered her father killing her little girlfriend when they were children at the age of 8. And he was convicted. He was a 51-year-old former firefighter, George Franklin, and he was accused of murdering her friend at the age of 8 based on her claimed memory. After 6 years, the conviction was tossed out and he was freed. The evidence that was used against him in court was publicly available. It was used against him, and the feeling afterwards was, that anybody could have made these accusations. The things that she remembered from the incident, she could have read somewhere. Okay, so Elizabeth Loftus at the University of Washington talked about the McMartin preschool case where the family working in this preschool were accused of sexually abusing children in the tunnels under the school, which didn't exist. She was saying that implanted false memories were possible with bad interrogation techniques. Mack pushed back on this when those sorts of accusations were made about abduction experiencers. He said that their trauma was real and that their memories were accurate, that they could, for example, there were independent witnesses that they were missing in time, and reason to believe that it wasn't entirely faulty memory. His research was rigorous, and it was backed up by 16 professionals. All of them saw all 750 abductees. Many relate evidence that there was some sort of reproduction or hybrid program that was central to all of this experience, and that secondary to it were the messages of some sort of apocalyptic event, a nuclear or ecological event. Fear for the earth, that droughts, famine, pollution, environmental collapse were going to lead to an economic collapse, a government collapse, and a social collapse. So there were weird physical things other than just their memories. For example, and there were eyewitnesses to these things. They'd wake up in bed with their clothes on backwards, or upside down in the bed, their head where their feet should be. Or they'd wake up tucked in, but so tightly tucked in. How would you do that? You couldn't do that for yourself. Or they'd be in their car, they'd be driving along, and then, abduction. They'd be in their car and they'd find themselves, they'd come to, and they'd be on the wrong road, going the wrong direction. Or their feet would be all muddy and wet in the bed. Soil samples that were taken in certain cases showed elevated radiation. They had scars that appeared overnight. They had implants that were taken out by Roger Lear, and the interesting thing about these implants is they would just sort of disintegrate in the petri dish. 16 different specialists examined them and could find no psychopathology. They did have PTSD troubles from their encounter, but their encounter didn't cause, how do I say this? They had troubles from the encounter. The encounter was not from the troubles. They weren't imagining things. If it's not a mental illness, could it still have been something psychological like mass hysteria? But they didn't know each other, and a lot of them were children. Some of them were children, or it started happening when they were children. They had a lot of resistance to remembering, emotional resistance to remembering, so it wasn't like they were looking for the attention. David Jacobs wrote Secret Life and said, "We've been invaded, and the focus is the production of children, and it's not good." He always took the kind of dark view of the whole event, whereas Mack tended to get more metaphysical. So Jacobs said, how could people pass through walls, be switched off, not see UFOs at all? Like there'd be a couple in bed, and one of them would be just sort of switched off while the other went through all this, while others nearby saw the UFOs clearly. Where were the UFOs and their occupants when they were not materializing in our Earth space? What planets did they come from, if at all, and how did they get here? Why were the beings so humanoid and their medical procedures such a parody of ours? Where were the hybrid babies being raised? If these were literally spacecrafts and alien beings, why was physical proof so elusive? If the phenomenon was neither psychic nor extraterrestrial, Max pondered, what was left? Jacques Vallée thought it might be interdimensional, with entities from some parallel universe penetrating our reality. It made sense to abductees. One said, I can really go to another time frame and can pull me from other time frames to here. Another said, there's been times when I've wondered if I've been put back in the wrong place for a couple of seconds. It feels, I don't know if I'm actually moving around through time. Another guy said, when they come, it's like someone shines a bright light behind the movie screen and obliterates the scene. What we perceive as the movie screen, what we call reality, they burn through, proving it's only a construct, a version of reality. Mack sent his draft of the abduction syndrome to colleagues for feedback. At this point, he said, it's somewhere between a long paper and a book. So, Chapter 20, Aliens at Harvard. Mack was offered a time slot at the Shop Club, which was a Harvard forum for the faculty, where they would go and try out what they called incompletely digested work. He spoke in front of about 40 colleagues, including the wife of the Harvard president. And there was a negative outcry, which really surprised him. He felt like he'd come out of the closet, kind of, and he was really surprised at how it was received. But he did feel emboldened, and he later did a presentation with Bud Hopkins to a packed auditorium at Harvard's Cambridge Hospital. So, let's see here. He's in the beginning of it, he wrote, I have a holiday treat. He didn't need to recite the speaker's bona fides, he said. This is at the speaking event. He's being introduced. John Mack was the founder of the Cambridge Hospital Psychiatric Department and a Pulitzer Prize winner. He was willing to stand up and be counted on the issue of nuclear deterrence and disarmament. Mack was a man of courage, and courage was the first of virtues to the ancient Greeks. But it carries with it an extraordinary penalty, being thought foolish or even mad. Heads in the audience bobbed knowingly. John has had attached to him those terms on many occasions, and some of you may think that way too. I want to warn you about that because today's foolishness is often tomorrow's wisdom. So he began by reminding the audience that in 1755, a professor of physics and math in Naples, a guy called Domenico Tata, was given a rock that had fallen from the sky, which was thought to be impossible, and he studied it in secret for fear of scorn until 1794. Mack told Harvard audiences, I don't have 39 years. So he summarized his experience, what he learned about the experience, from the sighting to the kidnapping to the testing to the hybridization to lost time and lost memory, the tales of planetary and ecological destruction, and the after effects like increased paranormal abilities. He said the abductees suffer the trauma of the experience, the trauma of isolation because no one believes them, a shattered sense of reality, terror that it can happen again, powerlessness to protect their own children. This often began in infancy and recurred globally. It doesn't seem to be pathology. They have nothing in common. It doesn't happen to only blondes or only people 25 years old. I mean, it's nothing in common. And they didn't appear to be attention seekers. Many of them wanted to remain anonymous. Many of them. Hopkins showed slides of UFOs that were authenticated by the Navy and NASA. He showed experiencers drawings of ETs, close-up pictures of scars. He played tapes of the regression of someone getting a needle in their belly. He introduced an abductee named Julia who told a story of her pregnancy being taken and having been shown a room full of babies and children. The audience, needless to say, was floored. So chapter 21, You Cannot Go Ahead. The UF community was grateful to John Mack. He got lots of negative reaction. Hopkins was helping him to edit his writing. He also got input from psychiatrists and scientists. But the wife of the Harvard president who had been at his presentation told him he could not go forward without more incontrovertible evidence. The editor of the psychiatric publication that he was trying to get this big paper put in told him, no, it was too long and there wasn't enough data. So no prized peer-reviewed article would appear in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which was a big disappointment to him. Chapter 22, Iron John. He got involved in Robert Bly's Iron John movement. Remember that? Male empowerment, because men are so powerless. He felt wounded by the domination of his stepmother. He did things like testing his macho by skydiving and doing sweat lodges. And he was still traveling to Russia with Ellsberg and to India to talk with the Dalai Lama about nonviolence and ETs. He did rituals at the Iron John thing that convinced him to move past his fear of publicly pursuing the abduction topic and ETs. Just go for it. Go ahead and put it out there. He did ayahuasca rituals, then he chickened out, and then he got involved with it again. He had a very complicated love life, which I'm not even going to go into, but just suffice it to say that he didn't appear to be capable of settling for one person, although he was married for 33 years, so I don't know. Chapter 23, Hello, Dali, D-A-L-I. He was invited to visit the Dalai Lama in 1992 to discuss ETs. The Dalai Lama said that Buddhists speak of three realms: the physical realm, the realm in between form and meditation, and then the subtle mind, which is the highest and formless realm. Sometimes the subtle mind will communicate with the physical in dreams or in certain experiences. So in other words, the Buddhists would not dismiss the possibility that something like this was happening. He told of Tibetan tales of people who were taken by little elves, and then an attendee described their encounter with men in black. So the question is asked her, why are some abductees okay and they flourish despite or because of this experience, while others are traumatized and don't do well, and it becomes a real issue for them? Why is that apparently true? And This has been going on throughout history. The myths of the flooded continents, Atlantis and Mu, annals of flying palaces and airborne chariots, celestial cars known as vimanas in the ancient Sanskrit scriptures called the Vedas, the Old Testament cylinder-shaped cloud and the pillar of fire that led the Jews out of Egypt, as well as the radiance around the Ark of the Covenant, too fearsome to look upon. They would reveal the Ark of the Covenant to enemy armies and they would die. Remember that from the Sword and the Seal. Sightings of fiery aerial crosses that predate Christianity, bloody shields in the sky that terrified the warring Anglo-Saxons, and spectral schooners seen sailing the skies of colonial America. What was to be made of these? Folklore was replete with abductions. Frankish and Cajun loup-garou, or werewolf, that waylaid the unwary to cattle-snatching witches. Incubi that copulated with humans at night, and diminutive fairies bereft of human warmth that took human children and replaced them with deformed replicas that often quickly died. They seemed an obvious parallel to the abductees' fetus stories. In the last years of the 19th century, before there were airplanes, witnesses were reporting phantom airships as if they somehow lay embedded in the collective psyche as an imminent new technology. Human abductions, kidnapping, people being seized, people losing control is as old as the human soul is old. So, were these stories really related to Jungian archetypes rising from the soul to consciousness and overwhelming the ego? The UFO could be mind-generated, psychokinetic manifestations of the consciousness of nature, Gaia, the living earth. Then they had documentation of ancient and historical references and art with UFOs shown in the art. I'm sure you can Google that and you can see beautiful Renaissance paintings, and there's a spaceship in the background. And it's not a bug, it's not an insect, it's absolutely a classical flying saucer. Mack said the aliens and we have much to learn from each other. They get to not have the knowledge of the heart and the spirit, and we learn that there is a spirit world and a larger universe. He was all in that these were aliens from outer space. All in. Chapter 24, Aliens at MIT. In June of 1992, MIT had the Alien Discussions Abductions Study Conference. There were 51 authorities with papers to present, and experiencers and journalists, and this included C.D.B. Bryan, who wrote Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind. And that book was based on the conference at MIT. Hopkins and Jacobs were there. The New Republic was there and then ridiculed Mack's introduction to Jacobs' Secret Life. Mack, introduced to the conference, said, when he was introduced to the conference, said, this was not a psychiatric disorder. The atomic physicist Phil Morrison was there, and he warned that we need to be skeptical that this can be unreliable because human beings are under stress here, and you just don't know. At the conference, many stories came from around the globe. For example, Fred Valentich from Australia, a 20-year-old. I've heard about this. I've heard the radio transmissions of this event. He was flying in Australia and starts to tell people over the radio, what I'm seeing is hovering. It's not an aircraft. It's following me. And then he just disappears. As for the Men in Black, software engineer Joseph Nyman presented a bizarre story. A Massachusetts woman named Marie had reported a 1983 UFO sighting to MUFON, and the case had been assigned to a volunteer, Jules Valancourt, who sent Marie all the forms to fill out. Valancourt never heard back. 5 years later, she contacted Valancourt again, and the case was referred to Nyman and a partner to check it out. They met with Marie and asked her why she'd never returned the form to Valancourt. Oh, but she had, Marie and her husband insisted. Valancourt had been telephoned to make an appointment and had visited them in May of '84. He arrived in a dull gray Mercedes with a gray interior, bearing the forms Marie had mailed to MUFON. He was 5'8" or 9", slim, with brownish hair, a mustache, and a pointed chin and nose. He wore a brown jacket and a tie and old-fashioned brown wingtip shoes. Later, under hypnosis, her husband Mike remembered offering him a drink and hearing in his mind something like, "This is none of your business. Keep out of it." Whereupon he retreated to the kitchen, and he realized, too, that he had seen the face before, as a hooded figure in a recurring nightmare. When Marie finally did meet Valancourt, she seemed surprised. "Well, you're not tall," she said. He had no mustache, and he did not drive a Mercedes. Who or what was impersonating Valancourt, or why? They had no idea, but it wasn't the real Valancourt. So stories of medical exams got reviewed, and the doctors present said, well, these are not sounding like real medical exams. This is not how that goes. There was an uproar when Bud gave the statistics from the poll that was done with money from Robert Bigelow that said that it'd be close to 3 million adults, 3 to 4 million adults who had experienced this. However, 14% of people on a Gallup poll said they had seen UFOs. So why are there so many abductees? And why are they returned with the wrong clothes, or clothes on backwards, or inside out, or naked? All these unanswered questions. Then Bud told of being teleported, of Linda Cortile being teleported from the 12th floor over the Brooklyn Bridge. And this was witnessed by cops and security guards and a VIP who was unidentified at first, but later on confirmed it was UN Secretary General Javier de Cuellar. And the question was, did this event happen in order for him to see this specifically? Was this some sort of kind of a message? Let's see. Researcher Brian Thompson reported on electromagnetic radiation. There was reason to believe that abduction accounts could be transmitted from investigators to experiencers and among experiencers by telepathy. As far back as 1930, the celebrated writer and social activist Upton Sinclair reported in his book, Mental Radio, on his own telepathic experiences with his wife, who was able to copy pictures from his mind. This carried forward by Albert Einstein, who wrote, quote, "In no case should the psychologically interested circles pass over this book." Subsequent research, Thompson told the conferees, suggested that their dream state enhanced telepathic communication to the point where two people might have the same abduction dream, possibly explaining shared abduction experiences. Upton Sinclair, I thought he wrote about labor problems, work labor. Carl Sagan refused to come and talk. He didn't want any part of it. Paul Horowitz, the Harvard physicist, came instead. And he said that there's been a radio search for intelligent life. It was cheap, it was easy to do, and they've been doing it. Mack scoffed and said that that was kind of an anthropocentric idea. He said you might as well be looking for a good Italian restaurant out in space. Why would you expect them to have radio waves? Mack asked why is it not aliens, the real and the unreal at the same time, something in between, like a quantum superstition or a superposition. Quantum superposition is quantum physics. It's the fact that matter can exist in two places at once. So he reiterated that these people are not mentally ill, they're telling the truth. David Hufford thought that the conference was too quick to dismiss the idea of sleep paralysis as part of the phenomenon, and too quick to ascribe alien abduction. The conference ended with more questions than when it had begun. So let's see here. I'm going to stop here. So this is the end of part 2. And we'll start part 3 in a second. So thanks. I'll be right back.